Well, thanks so much for coming, everybody. I know there's a lot of other tracks, and there are more specific to farming and agronomics and things like that. But this talk I'm going to give is sort of looking at the broader picture of small grains in the Corn Belt. So I'm just going to go through quickly and talk about, this is work that I started during my dissertation. I had a lot of really incredible project partners, and we're looking at the barriers and opportunities for small grains in the Corn Belt, including organics. And so I had an awesome team. I had Margaret Crome at the Michael Fields Ag Institute that helped us with the policy work, Alyssa Hartman of the Artisan Grain Collaborative, who's here doing a lot of food grade production, Alyssa McFarland, Vice President of the American Malting Barley Association, and Dr. Ryan Galt and Dr. Linda Prokopi that were my advisors through this. So I just want to mention that I did have a sample of organic farmers in this work that I'm going to speak to, and I'm going to disaggregate a lot of the data and show it by organic to conventional, but I'm also just going to show some data generally, and I think it's important because small grains are just really critical, obviously, to organic systems, cereal grains, and those rotations. So I think that is sort of broadly relevant. And also small grains can really act as a gateway to organic certification. So if there's better small grain markets, more small grain viability, more conventional farmers interested in organics would be willing to transition. And we also found out that organic has a lot to do with motivating small grain production, of course, and so we're able to sort of look at the role of organic in this process. So of course, I don't probably need to talk too much about the benefits of small grains to this group, but generally we're coming from the framework that small grains are good. We want more of them on the landscape given their environmental benefits, soil and water conservation, economic benefits instead of in terms of spreading risk, agronomic benefits on the farm, and then societal benefits in terms of helping support a regional grain economy. So this idea of a regional grain economy is, to me, what's really exciting and what motivated me to be a part of this work. And so this is, you probably may have seen this before, this is a really awesome graphic by the Artisan Grain Collaborative who worked with me on this project. And this is depicting folks throughout the regional grain supply chain. So they work a lot with connecting researchers, buyers, processors, advocates, all those folks all the way to consumers. And so I think this idea that we source more local grains and we get the benefits of small grains in our rotation in the Corn Belt, it tends to be a little bit less diverse. Unfortunately, that's of course not really happening in the Corn Belt. So this is, I think, a really telling graph of diversification. So we have down here, as being year, we have from 1925 to I think about 2022, and then over there on the y-axis, acres planted. And so we can see that there in the orange is corn, so it's been rising pretty steadily. Soybeans is that turquoise, it's just been skyrocketing. And then that green one is oats, that's been pretty steadily declining. I think the pink is wheat, and some of the other small grain crops. And so it's really telling the story that small grains are pretty either steady or declining, and have a much smaller portion of acres planted as corn and soybeans are rising. So this research focused across the upper Midwest states of Illinois, Iowa, Wisconsin, Minnesota. And I want to share a couple numbers that I think are also telling of our place on the landscape with organic small grain. So 7.9% of operations in these states grow small grain. 1.2% of operations are organic, and only 0.4% of operations grow organic small grains. So it's a really small piece of the landscape that we want to try and grow, given the benefits of small grains and the benefits of organic that I don't need to necessarily talk to here. So we asked ourselves in this project, well, to sort of get to that vision of a regional grain shed and to support farmers, how can we grow that regional grain shed and get more farmers to integrate small grains in their rotations? So we're specifically asking what are the factors that really hinder and help farmers to plant small grains, and then what opportunities exist to increase future grain production. So we came out with a report, and this is on our project website, and there's a QR code if you want to scan it, and I'll put this QR code up at the end as well. The report goes through a lot of our findings and a lot of our summary statistics, and I'm going to go through some of those here. So I'm not going to spend too much time on our methods, but basically what we did was we had a farmer survey. We had 406 farmers respond, and we did focus groups and interviews with farmers and folks throughout the grain chain. And I did some different types of analyses on that data. We did summary statistics, some network mapping, and some qualitative data. And I'm first going to go through, I think, what are some interesting overall findings in terms of small grains on the landscape in organics. It's generally with USDA data, we're not having that data disaggregated by small grain and organic, but we have that in our sample. We had 86 organic farmers respond. Primarily, the most popular crop that was grown was oats, and that was the same with conventional farmers, followed by cereal rye, wheat, barley, triticale, winter wheat, kernza, rye, barley, and actually no organic farmers were growing spelt in our sample. How we asked farmers how they're using their small grains, primarily using it as a cover crop as well as green manure, followed by sale as food grade, livestock feed bedding, sale as straw, seed on farm, sale for seed, and then sale for malting grade. So one thing is that more organic farmers were producing for food and beverage grade compared to conventional farmers. And slightly more organic farmers had livestock on farm. We also asked farmers why they grow small grains, and so by far the biggest reason was improved soil health, and that was also the same with conventional growers, followed by required from organic certification, spread risk, pest control, additional income, lower inputs, distribute labor, improve water quality, lower the use of agrochemicals, and as a backup crop. Finally, we asked farmers the most reliable information sources that they go to regarding small grains, and these are just organic farmers. And unsurprisingly, they said other farmers are their top information source, followed by nonprofit technical assistance providers, university extension, private crop consultants, fertilizers and chemical dealers, followed by agency conservation staff, and lastly, agronomists. And I want to note that this actually did look pretty different from the conventional farmers. Conventional farmers did have other farmers being their top information source, but fertilizer, chemical, and seed dealers were next, and extension was pretty far down the list. So that's interesting to show that nonprofit and university are either reaching organic a little bit more, or organic farmers are just going to those folks more. So I'm going to get back to sort of our overarching question: what are the factors that are most influencing diversification to small grains and corn and soybean systems? So here's a graphic that sort of depicts our overall results. And so I can walk you through, because there's a lot going on here. We have the little circles being the method that we use to come to this conclusion. We have farmer reported survey results, so some statistical results from correlation mapping, and then the farmer reported results from interviews and focus groups. So down here on the right, we have the factors that are barriers, the hindering factors to small grain production. And this is all small grain production, not just organic, but I think it's pretty similar. Markets and prices being a barrier, additional management required, adding a small grain into that system, as well as regional growing conditions, just harder to grow small grains out here in the Midwest compared to some of those more arid areas to the west of us. Up here we have some of the aspects that were noted as both a barrier and a driver. So access to equipment. If farmers had equipment to grow small grains, it was an asset to them. If they didn't, it was a barrier. Timing of planting and harvesting. So some farmers really liked the fact that they were distributing labor throughout the season and planting and harvesting at different times of the year, whereas other farmers were like, nope, I want 4th of July off. Improved varieties. Some farmers felt like they had access to the varieties that were suitable to their regional growing conditions. Others felt like they needed more. Over here on the left, we have the factors that were positive drivers of production. So synergies with cover crops. So that small grain allowing time for a cover crop to get into that system. The system benefits of small grains, reductions of pests and disease, weed management, things like that. Livestock. So being able to have a secondary outlet for your small grains so they didn't meet food quality production, as well as grazing, not stubble. Organic certification, certainly, so that requirement for a diverse system that cereal grains are an important part of. And then cost share availability, so that they had available cost share to them, that was a good thing, driver for them. I just want to note, though, that markets and prices were definitely the number one. Probably not a surprise to anybody in this room, but the distance to markets, the availability of markets, the price in their markets of their small grain crops was just a deterrent. So what's missing from that list? I just want to note that most of the Farm Bill policies were something we focused on in this project, asking farmers about crop insurance, revenue supports, loans, they did not mention as being important. And I'll show this a little bit more next. Also, the availability of technical assistance for small grains was not noted as a barrier to them. And then if there's anything else that folks in this room can think of that might not be on this list or on this sort of figure here, I would be very curious to hear. Does anybody think we're missing anything there? Or did we cover it all?
Does additional management require kind of roll labor into it?
Actually, labor availability is not on that list. That's a really good point. We didn't, you would add that, yeah. We didn't actually ask farmers that in the survey because the groups that I worked with to develop the survey didn't think that it was a big barrier, but I do think that that is really important. Is that in your experience, Ashley?
Yeah, and I don't know if it's just explicit to small grains necessarily, but as you add more crops to the rotation and expand your rotation, add more acres, the labor component really starts to bottleneck a little bit because growers don't necessarily want to have to hire and train somebody new, or they can't find somebody that they are comfortable with.
Right.
So I just think it kind of rolls into the organic system generally, but
Yep.
it might be a factor here as well.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important. Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. Yep.
What is specialized equipment on your list, especially for like grain cleaning or?
Yeah, well, so access to equipment was sort of both a barrier and a driver. But yeah, we don't have things like, processing isn't so much on there, sort of like past the farm gate. But what is your experience with the equipment barrier?
I actually missed it on your slide.
Oh,
Sorry, let's look at it.
Yeah, but do you find that to be a barrier?
Yeah.
Yeah. What kind of equipment particularly?
Especially processing, but those are for like smaller scale growers who are trying to clean the grain
Yep.
on their farm. They don't have, like for special grains like einkorn, spelt,
Yeah.
things that require to have a tougher seed coat.
Yep, definitely. Yeah. I was actually just talking to a farmer before I came in here that has an on-farm cleaning milling for einkorn, which I'd never heard of anybody having, but yeah, definitely a barrier. There's also equipment grants. I don't know if everyone's available knows about that are more recent. Anything else that folks could think of that we missed here? I wanted just to talk about just for organic farmers in terms of those barriers. So we have this as factors that are both helping and hindering, or neither. It doesn't really matter. So up here, in terms of those factors that are hindering organic small grain production, is again the price for small grains in their markets, distance to a buyer, and availability of markets. So we found the same thing amongst organic growers. And then the factors that were most helping organic growers was access to equipment, like we mentioned, for planting, harvesting, storing, and cleaning, and then the timing of planting and harvesting. So this is a figure that's a lot of statistics, and I'm not going to read through it, but we also asked farmers what their profitability was like after they added small grains to their corn and soybean rotation. And I thought it was really interesting because being certified, those growers that were certified organic or transitioning to organic were highly associated with profitability. So essentially, those folks that said that, yes, I'm organic, were much more likely to say, I increased my profitability after adding a small grain to my rotation. So good thing for organic, probably getting that premium on their small grains. Unfortunately, it was the opposite for those folks that said that they grew for food grade production. So those people that said that they were growing for either beverage grade, malting grade, or food grade were less likely to say that they increased their profitability after adding that small grain to their rotation. Just sort of an overview also of the role of organic certification in driving landscape change, diversification to small grains. So again, we found strongly associated with greater profitability after adding small grains to rotations. We found that it was a driver of small grain production, given those organic rotation requirements. But still, organic farmers, the ones that we talk to, are really struggling to break even financially on their small grain crop, and they're often forced to sell their small grain crop below the cost of production or as a feed grade when they're trying to sell it as a food grade. So we have a good quote here from a farmer in Illinois here that said, the corn and beans are very profitable. The small grain portion of the operation is where we struggle to make money. The profitability on the corn and beans is what supports the organic operation. Small grains is what we do pretty much because we are required to have that 3-crop rotation. So what we want to do, and what our research after this will try and continue to do, is to really grow the markets and the robustness of those prices for organic small grains to be able to support growers to have that diversified rotation. So I want to zoom in a little bit on markets here because that's clearly the number one barrier. In terms of the most common market channels that folks used in our sample, I divided this out by conventional and organic, conventional being the blue, organic being the yellow. So we can see that conventional growers were much more likely to use a grain elevator or co-op or a broker, but overall it was pretty similar. It went grain elevator, local livestock producers selling that as feed, direct to manufacturer, seed companies, direct to market. Organic growers were more likely than conventional growers to sell direct to market, direct to manufacturer, or direct to market. So I thought that was interesting. In terms of the contracts that they're using, we have conventional growers, a lot of them didn't use contracts with their buyers when they're selling their small grain crop, which is also interesting because a lot fewer organic growers were going without those contracts. So we have going without contracts being the most common for conventional. For organic, it was forward contracts through a grain buyer, followed by post-harvest contracts, informal agreements, contract to grow, buyback, and then futures and options. But there's just not a lot of futures contracts for small grains. There's no Chicago board traded prices for a lot of the small grains on the market. Does anyone have any thoughts on why fewer organic farmers are going without contracts for their small grains compared to conventional? Yeah, go ahead. What was that? Yeah, it could be they're not available, yeah. My thought on that was that it's probably because the organic ones are going for more of those food grade contracts, and so it's just more important that they have a contract available to them, and they're not sort of trying to mess around with that, but I thought it was interesting. Hi there. So we have a small grain marketing fact sheet that I developed with the UW-Madison O-Grain program. Does everybody know the O-Grain program? Okay, so I have copies of it here. You can scan the QR code, I'll have it at the end as well. But this resource goes through sort of, just options for marketing your small grains, best practices, and then has some of our survey and interview focus group results on what farmers are saying, how it's worked for them. A couple of the quick notes that I think are really interesting. A lot of people talk about with small grain markets that it's, we got to get the markets. We have to get the markets, and the markets are saying, well, we don't have consistent supply, and so it's which one is it? It's the chicken or the egg. So we saw on that earlier figure that improved varieties, equipment, cost share were really important to farmers in terms of whether or not they grow, and then of course markets, prices, processing. So this idea, well, if you build it, will they come? If you build that markets and infrastructure. And I think it's interesting to think about how we did it with soybeans. So soybeans were obviously a crop that are relatively recent in the history of the Corn Belt. So they came around about 100 years ago from the Orient. And actually here in the Peoria Research Station in Illinois is where they were developed through a ton of R&D into the soybeans that we have today. So there was a lot of effort and money that was poured into the development of soybeans. And of course, like we saw in that figure, they skyrocketed, and now they're an integral part of our cropping system. So how can we do that with small grains? I don't think it's a one-to-one. Of course, soybeans are nitrogen fixing, things like that, but I think it's a lesson that we can learn. So I found this great depiction of how soybeans came to be from this article in the journal Food Policy by William Lackeritz in 1988. And I'm going to read through it because I think it's super interesting. So he says, first, plant breeders had to develop adapted varieties by selection and breeding. Then agricultural advisors had to persuade farmers to raise the new crop and teach them how to do it well. Then engineers had to improve the availability of harvesting machinery and processing technology. Processors had to develop lucrative markets for the several co-products of soybean processing. And finally, the groups variously concerned with production, marketing, and processing of soybeans had to organize their respective activities into a single coordinated industry with effective pricing mechanisms and with consistent relationships between the supply and demand of whole soybeans and its products. Let's take a sip here. So to me, what this is saying is that when we hear this argument of supply or demand, that it's really about being a sort of simultaneous process. So we need effort on both ends of the supply chain. We need focus on markets, we need focus on supply, and we need focus on everything in between. So I think this is just a really interesting case for small grains to take from. I also want to note that, you know, a lot of our data and a lot of our responses from farmers showed us that it's not just about the financials of small grains. Even though markets and prices were number one, there were still a lot of farmers that grew small grains purely for those soil health benefits, purely for the benefits in the rotation. And so I think that leveraging those soil health benefits can also be a good way to get farmers on board with small grains and then also on board with organics. So a small grains researcher we talked to said, clearly small grains have lost ground to corn and soybeans in the last century. If you want to advocate for it, you're not going to get it back into the system by comparing it to one dimension. You need to put it in a whole systems context. This is to say, how are you going to get farmers to say that makes sense? So like looking at the whole system, those system benefits that we talked about earlier. Next, I want to sort of zoom in on Farm Bill policies, partially because I'm really interested in Farm Bill policies. I think they have a lot of influence on the landscape, even though farmers didn't say that they were necessarily important to them compared to prices and markets and prices. I think it's sort of something that's hard to elicit from a survey and from focus groups. And it's something that, you know, is potentially changeable, and that we're looking at a Farm Bill year. So the Farm Bill was supposed to be a new Farm Bill was supposed to be going into place this last year in 2023, and now it was a year extension because Congress couldn't come to any decision. So now it will be September 2024. So it's a good time to really be advocating for changes in the Farm Bill that support diversification and smaller specialty crops. So the titles this is a depiction of all of the money that goes into the Farm Bill. The ones that we focused on, the ones that are crop specific and that can influence a crop like small grains, is conservation, commodities, crop insurance, and then much smaller over here is credit. So I'm going to go over briefly, this is all the farmers in our sample. I'll divide it out by organic and conventional. But in terms of crop insurance and cost share program use, over here on the left, we found that those farmers that were growing small grains were the most common policy that they were using to insure their small grains was federal multi-peril, followed by crop hail. Fewer of them just didn't purchase crop insurance at all, and then even fewer of them used federal whole farm revenue, which is a new program if you're not aware of it. It came around in the 2014 Farm Bill, but it's got a lot of problems, so they're trying to work through some of those now. The reason that some farmers said that they didn't purchase crop insurance for their small grains was it was just too small a part of their operation to make it worth it. Federal whole farm is difficult to navigate. There's a lot of paperwork. And also, I'll say a lot of crop insurance agents don't really know how to work with it. In terms of cost share, the most common cost share used for small grains was EQIP, followed by CSP, didn't participate, and then cost share from a non-governmental source, like Practical Farmers of Iowa has a cost share for small grains, for example. Folks that didn't participate said it was just too much paperwork. And then this is cost share divided out by conventional and organic, and I won't spend too much time on it, but I want to highlight that in terms of both EQIP and CSP, organic farmers were much more, a much higher percent of organic farmers participated in those programs compared to conventional. In terms of crop insurance, so again, this is divided out by organic and conventional. We saw generally the same thing, federal multi-peril being the most common. But there was a difference in terms of whether folks did or didn't purchase any kinds of crop insurance for their small grains. And we see that conventional farmers were much more likely to say that they didn't purchase crop insurance at all, whereas more organic growers did purchase crop insurance. And again, does anyone have any idea why that might be the case, why organic farmers are more likely to purchase a policy on their small grain crop? I talked to a crop insurance agent that helped us write this fact sheet I'll talk about. She said she thought it was because they're growing a higher value crop that they're probably aiming for a food grade market for, and so they want to make sure that they insure it. A couple of numbers that I think are really interesting. So I think I'll start off by saying I think crop insurance and cost share are two programs that can really motivate farmers to take a risk and integrate a small grain into a rotation. And then I think that's also really important for organics, because small grains are an important part of diversified rotations. So if they can get that small grain in profitably, they might be more likely to try organic. So 84% of corn and soybean farmers didn't know whether or not crop insurance was available for small grains in their county. So there's just a huge lack of information about whether or not crop insurance is even available for small grains. So whether or not there's individual policies that can support those small grain crops. 77% of corn and soybean farmers didn't know whether cost share or conservation incentive payments were available for small grains. So again, sort of a missed opportunity. And so I have these crop insurance fact sheets that were also a part of the UW All Grain program that we just came out with this last month. And so this is a fact sheet that I developed with my colleagues, as well as some folks from the Center for Rural Affairs and Megan Vaith of Northbourne Organic Crop Insurance. And so this goes through sort of the ins and outs of crop insurance for organic and specialty grains. Oh, thank you. And so, yeah, feel free to access that. It hopefully should be a good resource, and it takes you through sort of what your options are depending on your situation. Quickly, a couple of farm policy key takeaways from our research. Most farm bill programs were not found to be important to whether or not farmers grow small grains. There's a widespread lack of knowledge about crop insurance and cost share for small grains, especially amongst non-small grain farmers. But subsidized crop insurance and cost share could really be better leveraged to support small grain production. Insurance policies for small grains with diversified operations need to be adjusted to make them worthwhile for farmers. So whole farm revenue being a potential there, but also just more policies that support small grains and that support different types of production. So whether or not that's intercropping, growing for food grade where you're going to have a higher reference price, things like that. Overall, our recommendations for how to support and leverage more small grain adoption, certainly investing in market development infrastructure, as well as better improved varieties for specific regional growing conditions, leveraging the playing field with corn and soybeans in terms of subsidies and supply mandates. So of course we have the ethanol mandate that really supports a lot of our corn production, and we have a lot of subsidies for corn and soybeans. Promote the drivers of existing small grain acreage, which we found to be certified organic production, integration of crops and livestock, systems thinking, and cover crop use. So that's all for me in my presentation, but I wanted to turn it over to you all to say, is there anything missing from this research? Are we telling the whole story of small grains on the landscape? And what do you think some of these top research priorities are for small grain production? So if anyone has any thoughts, I'd love to hear them.
Oats and other small grains. Yeah. And we need better tolerance to stress conditions. Like, especially coming from Indiana, I hear growers complain about less weight, protein content problems, that kind of thing. So I just keep talking about we need breeding programs to address that.
Yep. Yeah, it's interesting. Small grains are considered the orphan crop, right? So they don't have a lot of private sector investment given a lot of their traits. So they're sort of left in the public sector, but we've been losing a lot of small grain breeders. So I think actually Iowa State lost an oat breeder, and did they replace an oat breeder at Iowa State yet? Luckily we have some oat breeding at ISU here, but, or U of I don't know if ISU has U of I certainly. But yeah, we definitely need a lot more breeding to happen. I think that's a really important piece of the puzzle. Anything else that folks can think of? Yeah.
Well, I have a question or so.
Yeah.
I mean, how small is small? Like, what makes something a small grain versus large?
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. Yeah. Yeah, well, I mean, I'm not an agronomist. I'm probably not the best person to answer that question, but I just know that we considered in this project, actually it was actually basically what Practical Farmers of Iowa considers a small grain, but anything basically that's not corn and soybeans. So we did, wheat, barley, rye, triticale, oats sort of being those primary ones. We didn't consider buckwheat to be a small grain, and that's given the qualities of buckwheat that I really couldn't speak to. But yeah, cereal grains generally. Yeah. Was your, right here?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a question, but that quote from that Illinois farmer, the profitability one, I mean, besides markets being the obvious, profitability issue, is it a disease issue? Is it a low test weight, like you mentioned? I mean, did you see any common themes emerge in that lack of profitability conversation?
I did, yeah. I'm going to have Ashley say what she thinks after I talk because she's probably even better. But I mean, I think that it's primarily an opportunity cost. So anytime they're putting a small grain into rotation, well, especially in places where you can't double crop, you're just losing that potential to gain a lot more income from corn and soybeans. I think that there's, maybe not also considering the whole picture in terms of our return on investment. So obviously small grains are they don't require nearly as much inputs. They're not as nitrogen intensive, and the inputs are cheaper, the seed's cheaper, and things like that. So I think that's something to think about in terms of the whole system, but I think it's primarily the opportunity cost. And then when they're trying to grow to food grade production, like you said, there are a lot of issues with pests and disease, aflatoxin, meeting protein content, falling numbers, all of those things that they're talking about. I think a lot of other sessions here we're trying to address to be able to get that premium. But it's just difficult because they're growing these small grains out west that production has primarily migrated out west. We used to grow a lot of small grains in the Midwest just only a couple decades ago. But with production out west, they're just meeting those quality standards easier than we are here. What would you say, Ashley?
Well, I think farmers want to grow the small grains, but they have those barriers in place.
Mm-hmm.
Like, something I noticed working with organic growers is that they are really interested in growing all kinds of things, but there's a lot of barriers to keep them in corn and soybean rotation primarily. So,
do you see markets as the biggest barrier?
yes.
Okay. I didn't know if you might think that something about like management, production, things like that.
Small grains are really important for the weed control aspect of rotations on the organic farm. Like, you see them very densely, and they can help prevent some issues with some of the larger weeds that tend to proliferate, especially when folks are going through transition and early organic production. But yeah, I think more folks will be growing these if the market opportunity was a lot wider.
Definitely. Yeah.
I was going to say that what I hear from my organic growers is just like your comment, that they have a much easier time with the organic buyers selling their corn and soybeans, whether it's food grade or white corn or whatever, a specialty soybean. When it comes to the small grains, they have a much harder time getting that premium.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. And I think there's a lot of work happening. Artisan Grain Collaborative is a big part of that, about trying to develop more lucrative food grade markets and trying to connect farmers to these larger buyers, trying to get buyers like General Mills and other folks to start using small grains and sourcing locally. I know that Oatly, that big oat mill company, had a trial with Practical Farmers of Iowa to see if they could get some farmers to meet quality standards in Iowa so they could start sourcing more locally. I mean, we have, Quaker Mill has the mill in St. Ansgar in Iowa and doesn't source anything locally. So I think there's a lot of opportunity, but I think that just, needs help all along the way. I want to go to my next question before we end up too, because we're actually applying for a grant and trying to work a little bit more specifically on organic small grain production past the farm gate. And I will be working on, what are the policy mechanisms that can really support that kind of production. And so that's at the local level, state level, federal level. What can we do to support that, whether or not it's tax breaks, other incentives, trying to get millers and local processors to incorporate small grains. So if anyone has any thoughts, I know it's kind of a big question, but I would love to hear if anyone has any thoughts on what any possibilities are there. One thing that was interesting is in, I think it was Michigan, they have a tax break for distillers and brewers that source the local small grain. And so that's something that's really interesting that could potentially be integrated in other places. We were just at Briggs yesterday, so I think that's a really kind of prime example that they could be benefiting. They're trying to source more local grains. I think they said 50% right now they're sourcing locally, so that number could definitely increase. And then, places like in New York, the Green City Farmers Market has a rule that they have to include, which I can't remember that percentage. Maybe it's all grains? Is it all grains grown sold at the market have to be within a certain radius? And so, markets farmers markets in the Midwest, or at least where I'm from in Northern Illinois, aren't super robust, but I think they can grow. And I think if we have some sort of standards on how much, where they can source from, that can be a potential market, especially if we have, like you mentioned, more local processing and cleaning and things like that. Well, are there any other thoughts questions or thoughts that we may have missed here? Yeah.
Are there any other policies that you've heard from other states or areas that you're looking at?
Yeah, that we will look at. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's certainly a reduction on crop insurance. So right now there's been states like Indiana that have a discount crop insurance. I think it was like $5 for growing a cover crop. I think that could be brought into a third crop in a rotation. I think that would be really awesome. And it's interesting because there's cost share that's available for a higher amount, right, to grow a cover crop, but people really like it being a discount on crop insurance for some reason. And so those programs are immediately, I think, sell out. So I think that's a good potential. I think more robust cost share programs, certainly, especially ones that emphasize small grains. So EQIP and CSP, you can do small grains as a part of that, but generally you can't sell it as a market crop. And so we need cost share that really supports farmers to be able to take that grain and sell it, especially food grade quality.
So one thing that's interesting to me and frustrating to me is that this is as of January 2018, and I don't know if this has changed, but in Indiana, there's not blanket coverage for oak crop insurance unless you're in Jane Randolph counties, which are on the eastern side of the state.
Yeah.
So having more coverage and more experience in our counties for folks to insure oaks, I think would be a step in the right direction.
Totally.
Not solve any major problems probably, but I've almost just been like.
Right. Right. So a couple things there, because crop insurance is so fascinating. So, I mean, there's no canned policy for oats in some counties if there's just not a lot of oat production. So crop insurance is all demand driven. Those canned individual policies are driven by whether or not there's a lot of people in the region that grow it. So it's very correlational to just the extent of production in the region. But that doesn't mean you can't get a custom agreement. So they call it an XC agreement. And so you can always talk to your crop insurance agent and say, I want a custom agreement for these oats. However, I think it would be obviously much better if we have those canned policies for oats that are just cut and dry. This is what I want. It's harder because there's not those prices available, those publicly traded prices, but I think whole farm revenue is a really great solution to that, because so essentially the way whole farm revenue works is that they're taking your tax history and ensuring that total revenue of your operation as opposed to going by crop. Right? So it doesn't matter, you don't need a specific policy for your oats or your buckwheat or your spelt. There's something that's going to be difficult to maybe insure in an individual level from an agent that has never tried that before. And there's no county T yield, things like that. But whole farm revenue just allowing all of those crops to come in under one policy. Yeah.
The only issue with that is if you're a beginning farmer,
yes,
your taxes don't look good in the beginning.
There are some stipulations for our beginning farmers and how that works, but yeah, I don't think whole farm revenue really works for beginning farmers. You need that, and then another thing in terms of beginning farmers, they don't have that production history. So if they're trying a new crop, they don't have and not just beginning farmers, but all farmers that are trying a new crop. I could have been growing corn and soybeans for 50 years. I'm going to try, integrating a spelt or something like that. I don't have a production history. I don't have an APH. You can use county T yields, but if I'm the only one growing that in my county, there's no county T yields. I go to my neighbor county, there's no county T yields over there either. So there needs to be more robustness built into the system about how to insure those crops when someone's sort of the sole ranger there.
I've written a number of letters of adaptability that comes from
Yes.
the kind of weird stuff. So like
Yeah.
spelt, for example, is one that was
Yep.
in a county nearby that there's no production history in
Right.
basically the entire state. So you have to then work with that crop insurance agent to try to figure out some crop that's comparable to that.
Right.
And then I was always kind of nervous about doing those letters of adaptability because I wanted to make sure that the grower was getting the best policies. So like kind of overshooting the yields
Right.
and all that stuff. But
Right. Yeah, you often need a letter from an agronomist stating that adaptability, and then they'll use a similar crop as a pricing mechanism and things like that. Yeah.
it's not perfect, but it's something.
It's something. But again, like I think a lot of it's, demand driven. I mean, it would be great to have it come from the top down, but if more farmers, more people are asking for those policies for small grains, even though farmers, it's not the #1 barrier, it's still a little bit of a barrier and it's still something that we can do. So yeah, I encourage you to grab the crop insurance fact sheet because that helps take you through it. Yep.
Did they mention a barrier with it, like bank and getting like
Yeah.
financing for
Yeah.
starting as well?
You know, that's interesting. Margaret Crome, the policy director, Michael Fields, really came into this project thinking that was a big barrier. She had heard from farmers, and we found that it wasn't. And I think there's still certainly some farmers will say that you were, but overall in our sample, we saw from that figure that I showed, very few farmers listed it as either a barrier or a deterrent. And so we had Paul Dietman from Compeer Financial on our advisory board for this, and he just kind of said over and over, like, it really doesn't matter. Like, as long as you can show that you have, decent finances and are a good farmer, we'll make it work. I mean, that's not to say that we don't, of course, hear some other things, but yeah, it doesn't seem to be a big barrier. We've also found that in another project I'm on, the diverse corn belts. The farmers also said that it wasn't a barrier to diversification. Is that your experience, though? Would you agree?
I just wondered because there are some banks here that are pro-organic,
Right.
and, trying
Yeah.
to help opportunities, and I just wondered if that was the same elsewhere, if that was something people were looking for.
Yeah, well, I think it's small grains, maybe not necessarily, but I definitely think in terms of if you're trying to like start an orchard, or an horticultural operation, and I'm just trying to outright get a loan to start that operation or to plant perennials or something like that, then we definitely hear that financing is an issue. Yeah, but I think with small grains, they're already similar to other row crops that it's not. Yeah. Well, that's probably my end of time here, but thanks so much for your attention, and yeah, feel free to pick up anything here.